The sound was not the rhythmic thud of a baker's pin against dough, nor was it the gentle whisking of cream in a copper bowl. It was a sharper sound, a crystalline crunch that echoed against the damp stone walls of a cellar in the heart of London. Under the flickering, sickly yellow light of a single tallow candle, a pair of trembling, scarred hands worked a heavy marble pestle. Each rotation of the stone pulverized the fragments of a broken crystal flute into a shimmering, lethal powder. To a casual observer, it looked like the finest granulated sugar, the kind used to frost the delicate petals of a royal confection. But this was not meant to sweeten. "They say the Duke has a taste for the finest things in London," a voice whispered into the shadows, raspy from years of cheap gin and inhaled flower dust. "Tonight, I shall give him a taste of the one thing he spent a lifetime trying to bury." Welcome to a story of shadows, sugar, and a vengeance 10 years in the making. If you find yourself drawn into this world of Victorian secrets, please consider subscribing to the channel to support our narratives. And as the story unfolds, I would love for you to leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10. Your engagement is the fuel that keeps these lanterns burning. Now let us step back into the fog of 1888, where the line between a masterpiece and a murder is as thin as a layer of spun sugar. London, in the autumn of 1888, was a beast with two faces. Above, in the sprawling mansions of Mayfair, the air was thick with the scent of expensive French perfumes and the soft glow of new gas lamps. But below, in the vein-like alleys of the East End, the city breathed a different air. A thick, yellow, pea-souper fog crawled off the black waters of the Thames, smelling of rotting cabbage, coal soot, and the metallic tang of human misery. In a cramped room above a tanner's shop in Bermondsey, Elias Thorne sat on the edge of a sagging cot. The smell of curing hides, sour and ammonia-rich, seeped through the floorboards, but Elias hardly noticed. He was staring at his hands. Once those hands were celebrated as the most skillful in England. 10 years ago, Elias Thorne was the proprietor of a Bond Street patisserie where even princesses waited in line for his millefeuille. He had a shop that smelled of vanilla and yeast, a wife who laughed like a bell, and a daughter, Mary, whose eyes held the sparkle of the morning dew. Today Elias was a ghost in a stained white apron. His fingers were mapped with the silver lines of old sugar burns, and his spirit was a hollow shell, crushed by a tragedy the law had chosen to ignore. After Mary disappeared while working as a scullery maid at Ashbourne House, his world had collapsed. His wife died of a broken heart a year later, and Elias had traded his rolling pin for a bottle of Mother's Ruin gin. He was a man waiting for the end. Until the morning, a black carriage with a ducal crest rattled through the slums, bringing a summons that felt like a cold blade to the ribs. The Duke of Ashbourne was a man whose wealth was a fortress built on the broken backs of the invisible poor. He was the embodiment of Victorian corruption, a man who could buy a judge's silence as easily as a new horse. Now he was preparing for the wedding of the century, a political union with the daughter of a wealthy industrialist. The Duke needed a centerpiece, something to dazzle the high society he so desperately craved to lead. He didn't just want a cake, he wanted a monument, and he knew that despite the gin and the filth, there was only one man in England capable of building a 5-tier spice cake that could pass for a cathedral of sugar. When Elias was brought into the presence of the Duke, the air in the mahogany-lined study felt thin. The Duke sat behind a desk of polished oak, looking at Elias not as a human being, but as a discarded tool that might still have one good use left. "Thorne," the Duke said, his voice as smooth as velvet and just as cold, "you look diminished. But I am told your talent remains, even if your character has rotted. You will create the wedding feast centerpiece, 5 tiers, spun sugar, silver leaf, and the spice blend that made you famous. Do this and your debts are cleared. Refuse, and the debtor's prison has a cell with your name on it." Elias looked at the man. He remembered the night Mary didn't come home. He remembered standing at the service entrance of Ashbourne House, begging for news, only to be tossed into the gutter by the Duke's footman. He saw the Duke's eyes, arrogant, untouched by guilt. Elias felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a decade. It wasn't hope. It was a cold, righteous rage. "I will bake your cake, Your Grace," Elias said, his voice steady for the first time in years. "It will be a meal no one in this house will ever forget." But as Elias descended into the labyrinthine kitchens of Ashbourne House to begin his work, he realized the Duke's house held more than just painful memories. The kitchens were a hellscape of heat and noise. Huge roasting spits turned over open fires, and a small army of servants scurried like rats under the lash of the chef de cuisine's tongue. It was there, in the soot-stained corners of the scullery, that Elias saw her. She was a spit-boy assistant, though clearly a girl disguised in oversized rags. She couldn't have been more than 12. She was mute, moving with a trembling, bird-like caution, her face perpetually smeared with ash. But it wasn't her silence that stopped Elias's heart. As she bent over to scrub a copper pot, a small object tumbled from the collar of her tunic. It swung on a piece of dirty twine, a silver locket, scratched and dented, but unmistakable. Elias felt the world tilt. He had hammered that locket himself from a silver shilling for his daughter Mary on her 10th birthday. Inside, though the girl didn't know it, was a tiny engraving of a wheat stalk, the symbol of the Thorne family bakery. The girl, whom the other servants called Pip, was the living evidence of a secret the Duke thought he had buried. Mary hadn't just disappeared, she had been used and discarded, but she had left behind a child. Pip was the Duke's own flesh and blood, a granddaughter of the aristocracy, treated like vermin in the very house she should have inherited. The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. He watched the Duke's butler, a man with a face like a hatchet, kick Pip aside because she was moving too slowly. The girl didn't cry out. She simply curled into a ball, clutching the locket to her chest as if it were the only thing keeping her soul attached to her body. Elias realized then that the Duke didn't just hire him for his skill. The Duke wanted him under his thumb again, a final humiliation. The Duke knew exactly who Pip was, and he kept her there as a sick trophy of his power over the Thorne bloodline. Later that evening, the Duke visited the kitchen, his polished boots clicking on the damp flagstones. He leaned in close to Elias, the smell of expensive brandy wafting from his breath. "The girl Thorne," the Duke whispered. "She's a clumsy thing. I've been thinking of sending her to Newgate. I suspect she's been stealing from the silver pantry. A few years in a prison cell might straighten her back, if she survives the winter." It was a threat, clear and lethal. If the cake wasn't a masterpiece, if Elias dared to speak of the past, Pip would be destroyed. Elias looked into the Duke's eyes and saw the darkness there, a void that no amount of wealth could fill. He understood then that there would be no justice from the courts, no mercy from the church. The only law in Ashbourne House was the Duke's whim. But the Duke had forgotten one thing. A baker knows how to transform ingredients. He knows that heat can harden or soften, and that even the smallest grain of salt can change the flavor of a feast. Elias began his work. He was given a private corner of the kitchen, cordoned off from the prying eyes of the other cooks. He worked with a feverish intensity, his scarred hands moving with a grace they hadn't possessed in years. He called for the finest spices from the Orient, the purest butter from the countryside, and the most expensive granulated sugar from the Caribbean. But at night, when the kitchen fires died down to embers and the rest of the staff slept in their crowded barracks, Elias went on a different hunt. He moved through the grand dining room like a shadow, collecting the broken crystal flutes left behind by the Duke and his drunken companions. These were fine, leaded crystal, expensive, delicate, and when ground down, utterly invisible. He took the shards back to his mortar and pestle. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound was his heartbeat. He wasn't just grinding glass, he was grinding the Duke's arrogance. He was preparing a diamond dust that would sparkle beautifully in the candlelight of the ballroom. It would look like a dusting of winter frost on the deep brown spice cake. It would be beautiful. It would be magnificent. As the days bled into a week, the tension in the house became a physical weight. Elias spent his few moments of rest watching Pip from afar. He began to leave small treats for her. A scrap of honey cake, a piece of dried fruit, hidden in the folds of a clean cloth. He saw the way her eyes widened when she tasted them, a flicker of humanity returning to a child who had been told she was nothing more than soot and bone. One afternoon, while the chef de cuisine was occupied with a delivery of venison, Elias managed to pull Pip into the shadows of the pantry. He pointed to the locket. "Who gave you that?" he whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Pip looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. She touched the silver disc and made a small swaying motion with her hand, like a mother rocking a cradle. Then she pointed up, not to heaven, but to the floors above, where the Duke resided. Elias felt a tear carve a path through the flower on his cheek. "She was my daughter," he breathed, "and you are my blood." Pip didn't understand the words, but she felt the shift in the air. She reached out a small, grime-streaked hand and touched the scars on Elias's wrist. In that moment, the baker was no longer a broken man seeking a way to die. He was a protector. He was an executioner. But the Duke's spies were everywhere. The butler, a man named Holloway, had been watching the interaction from the doorway. He didn't speak, but the cold smile that touched his lips told Elias everything. The loop was tightening. The wedding of the century was only 48 hours away, and the Duke was not the only one with secrets. Elias knew he had to move faster. He needed more than just the glass. He needed the truth to be as undeniable as the pain the glass would cause. While the house slept, he began to explore the butler's pantry, searching for the one thing he knew a man like the Duke would keep, a record of his debts and his payoffs. Behind a false panel in the silver chest, Elias found it, a black, leather-bound ledger. As he flipped through the pages by the light of a stolen candle, the sheer scale of the Duke's depravity was revealed. Payoffs to local constables to ignore unfortunate accidents involving housemaids. Payments to a doctor in Whitechapel for discreet services. And there in the middle of the book was Mary's name. Beside it, a single cold entry. Problem resolved. Child retained for labor. The white sugar of the wedding cake would represent the Duke's polished public image, his standing in the House of Lords, and his grand marriage. But the glass hidden within, and the black book hidden in Elias's tunic, would be the lethal truth of his character. The stage was being set. The flour was sifted, the spices were ground, and the diamond dust was ready. Elias Thorne, the man the world had forgotten, was about to serve a banquet that would stain the history of London forever. But as the first tier of the cake went into the oven, a question remained. Could a man who had lost everything survive the explosion of his own vengeance? Or would he and Pip be consumed by the same fire that was meant to burn the Duke? The answer lay in the heat of the oven and the sharpness of the glass. And as the sun began to rise over the foggy London skyline on the eve of the wedding, Elias looked at the towering cake and whispered a final prayer to the daughter he had failed. "Justice is the only meal that truly satisfies," he murmured, his eyes reflecting the cold, grey light of the morning. "And your grace. I hope you're hungry." The heat in the kitchens of Ashbourne House was not merely a physical sensation. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to vibrate with the tension of 100 unspoken secrets. As the clocks across London chimed midnight, signalling the final 24 hours before the wedding of the century, Elias Thorne stood before his creation. The 5 tiers of the spice cake rose like a monument of ivory and shadow. To any other eye, it was a masterpiece of Victorian confectionery, but to Elias it was a scaffold. Every delicate swirl of frosting, every perfectly placed silver leaf was a step toward a reckoning that the Duke of Ashbourne could never have imagined. But the path to justice was becoming a narrow, crumbling ledge. The first of the new obstacles arrived in the form of Monsieur Lefebvre, the Duke's personal chef de cuisine. Lefebvre was a man whose ego was as inflated as his soufflés, and he had viewed Elias with a simmering resentment from the moment the gutter pâtissier had been brought into his kitchen. Lefebvre didn't believe in the Duke's charity. He believed in perfection and control. "You move like a man with a heavy conscience, Thorne," Lefebvre remarked, his voice cutting through the steam and the clatter of copper pans. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowed as he inspected the smooth surface of the 3rd tier. "The Duke is pleased with your progress, but I find your methods secretive. You refuse to let my assistants help with the final frosting. You work only in the dead of night. One might think you were hiding a flaw in the sponge." Elias didn't look up from his work. His hands, though trembling deep inside his bones, remained steady as he applied a layer of white icing. "A masterpiece requires a singular vision, monsieur," he replied, his voice a low rasp. The spice blend is volatile. If the ratios are disturbed by a clumsy hand, the entire flavor profile is ruined. I am protecting the Duke's reputation. Is that not what we are all paid for? Lefebvre spat on the floor, a gesture of pure spite. The Duke's reputation is a fortress. Yours, however, is a ruin. Do not forget that I am watching you. If so much as a single crumb is out of place, I will ensure you never see the sun through anything but iron bars. As Lefebvre retreated into the shadows of the pantry, Elias felt the sweat go cold on his neck. The chef's suspicion was a ticking clock, but the danger was only beginning. Halloway, the Duke's butler, had become a permanent fixture in the doorway, a silent, black-clad shadow that didn't seem to blink. Halloway was the Duke's attack dog, the man who handled the discreet matters mentioned in the black ledger tucked against Elias's ribs. The weight of that ledger was a constant reminder of the stakes. It wasn't just a book of numbers, it was a book of ghosts. Every time Elias felt his resolve waver, he touched the leather binding and thought of the names written inside. Mary, Sarah, Elizabeth. Dozens of girls who had entered Ashbourne House with hope and left as entries in a column of problems resolved. The situation worsened an hour later when a muffled cry echoed from the scullery. Elias dropped his offset spatula and hurried toward the sound. There, near the massive coal-fired range, he found Pip. The girl was huddled on the floor, her small hand clutched to her chest. A footman stood over her, his face twisted in a sneer. "Clumsy little rat," the footman growled. "She tripped and nearly spilled the Duke's morning tea service. I should give her a taste of the lash to teach her balance." "Leave her," Elias commanded, his voice ringing with a sudden, unexpected authority. The footman laughed. "And who are you to tell me my business, Baker? You're just a guest of the Duke's mercy." Elias stepped forward, his eyes burning with a cold light that made the younger man hesitate. "I am the man making the cake that will determine whether your master is the toast of London or the laughingstock of the peerage. If I am distracted by your incompetence and the cake fails, I will tell the Duke exactly whose fault it was. Do you think he will be merciful to you?" The footman's sneer vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He muttered a curse and stomped away, leaving Pip trembling in the soot. Elias knelt beside her, his heart breaking at the sight of her blistered skin. He took a small tin of cooling lard from his pocket, something he had kept for his own burns, and gently applied it to her hand. "It's all right, little one," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "Not much longer. I promise you, not much longer." Pip looked at him, and for the first time, Elias saw a spark of recognition in her gaze. She reached out with her uninjured hand and touched the silver locket around her neck, then pointed to the cake. She didn't have the words to ask if he was her salvation or just another monster in a white apron, but the question was there, written in the hollows of her cheeks. Elias returned to his workstation, but the interaction had left him shaken. The emotional toll was becoming unbearable. As he worked, his mind drifted back to the Bond Street patisserie, to the smell of fresh brioche and the sound of Mary's laughter. He remembered the day he had given her the locket. He had told her it was a piece of him that would always be with her, a shield against the world. "I failed you, Mary," he thought, the words a silent scream in the vacuum of his mind. "I let you go into this house of wolves, and I didn't pull you back. I spent 10 years drowning in a bottle while your daughter became a ghost in the cellar." The guilt was a bitter spice, more potent than the cloves and cinnamon he was mixing. He realized that the diamond dust, the pulverized glass, wasn't just for the Duke. It was a manifestation of Elias's own shattered life. Every shard he ground into powder was a memory he couldn't fix, a mistake he couldn't undo. He wasn't just an executioner, he was a man performing an autopsy on his own soul. But was he becoming the very monster he sought to destroy? Was grinding glass into a wedding cake the act of a just man? Elias looked at the towering white tiers. To the guests, it would be a symbol of purity and high society. To the Duke, it was a throne made of flour. But to Elias, it was the truth. The Duke's life was a polished surface hiding a jagged, lethal interior. The cake would simply be a reflection of the man who ordered it. "He wants the finest things," Elias whispered to the empty air. "He wants the world to swallow his lies. Well, let him swallow this." The turning point came as the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the high barred windows of the kitchen. A telegram arrived, delivered by a breathless messenger in the Duke's livery. It wasn't for Elias, but Halloway read it aloud to the chef de cuisine, unaware that Elias was listening from behind a stack of flour sacks. "The bride's father, Mr. Sterling, is arriving early," Halloway said, his voice tight. "He brings with him several associates from the London Gazette. They want a preview of the festivities for the evening editions. The Duke is concerned. He wants the scullery cleared of unsightly elements, especially the girl." Lefebvre nodded. "The spit boy. What shall be done with her?" "The Duke has ordered her moved to the Blackfriars workhouse tonight," Halloway replied coldly. "He wants her out of the house before the guests arrive. A carriage will be here at dusk. Once she's in Blackfriars, she'll be forgotten within a week. The records there are flexible." Elias felt the floor drop away beneath his feet. Blackfriars. It was a death sentence for a child as frail as Pip. It was a place where unsightly elements were worked to the bone and buried in unmarked graves. The Duke wasn't just hiding her, he was erasing her. This was the moment. The open loop of the Duke's plan was closing, and Elias had only hours to act. The pressure cooker environment of the kitchen had reached its breaking point. He could no longer wait for the perfect moment during the banquet. He had to ensure that when the Duke fell, he fell with such violence that he could never reach for Pip again. Elias moved to the final stage of his plan. He took the mortar and pestle from its hiding place. The diamond dust was ready, a shimmering fine powder that looked exactly like the expensive granulated sugar used for the wedding frosting. He began to apply it to the top tier, the one the Duke and his bride would cut into for the ceremonial first bite. But as he worked, a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. Elias froze. He didn't turn around. He could smell the scent of expensive tobacco and old port. It was the Duke. "It looks magnificent, Thorne," the Duke said, his voice a low purr. "Truly a work of art. I almost regret that it must be eaten." Elias forced his breathing to remain steady. "Art is fleeting, Your Grace. Its purpose is to leave a lasting impression." The Duke walked around the table, his eyes tracing the lines of the cake. He stopped near the top tier, leaning in so close that Elias could see the fine veins in his nose. The Duke reached out a finger, intending to swipe a bit of the frosting for a taste. Elias's heart stopped. If the Duke tasted it now, the irritation would begin too early. The grit of the glass, though fine, would be noticed by a man not yet distracted by the pomp and wine of the ballroom. "Your Grace, please," Elias said, his voice sharp. "The silver leaf hasn't set. If you touch it now, the oils from your hand will tarnish the finish. It would be a tragedy to spoil the perfection so close to the hour." The Duke paused, his finger inches from the lethal powder. He looked at Elias, a cold, mocking smile playing on his lips. "Perfection. Yes. You always were a stickler for the details, Thorne, just like your daughter. She had a certain stubbornness about her, a belief that things should be a certain way." The Duke leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Elias could hear. "I know you found the locket, Elias. I saw you with the girl in the pantry. Do you think I am blind? I kept her here to remind myself that even the most talented men can be broken. I kept her as a shadow of your failure." Elias felt the rage flare up, a white-hot sun in his chest. But he kept his face a mask of stone. "Tonight, Thorne," the Duke continued, "after I have taken my vows and the girl is on her way to Blackfriars, I will have Halloway settle your account. You will be given enough money to leave London and never return. If you ever speak her name or the name of your daughter, I will find you, and I will make what happened to them look like a mercy." The Duke patted Elias on the arm, a gesture of ownership, and walked out of the kitchen, his laughter echoing against the cold stone walls. Elias stood alone in the center of the kitchen, the weight of the world on his scarred shoulders. He looked at the cake, he looked at the black ledger hidden in his tunic, and then he looked toward the scullery where Pip was being forced to scrub one last floor before her exile. The Duke thought he had won. He thought he had bought Elias's silence with a threat and a bag of gold. He didn't understand that a man who has already lost everything has nothing left to fear. "But this was only the beginning," Elias whispered to the flickering candle. "The Duke wants a wedding, I will give him a funeral. What happened next was a blur of frantic, calculated motion. Elias knew he couldn't just poison the Duke. He had to destroy the Duke's world. He had to ensure that the diamond dust did its work, while the eyes of the world were watching. He had to turn the wedding of the century into the banquet of bloody throats. As the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the London fog in shades of bruised purple and orange, the first carriages began to arrive at the front gates of Ashbourne House. The elite of England, bishops, lords, and the titans of industry, were stepping out into the gaslight, unaware that they were about to witness the fall of a giant. And in the kitchen, Elias Thorne picked up his silver serving knife. He wasn't just a baker anymore. He was the hand of fate. And as he prepared to wheel the towering masterpiece into the grand ballroom, he knew that by midnight, the truth would be the only thing left on the table. But would the ledger be enough to save Pip? Or had the Duke already moved his pieces too far across the board? The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the heat of 1,000 candles, and the final act was about to begin. The air in the grand ballroom of Ashbourne House was so thick with the scent of lilies and the heat of 1,000 beeswax candles that it felt like a physical weight against the lungs. Above, the crystal chandeliers vibrated with the low hum of the London elite, men in stiff collars and silk waistcoats, women draped in diamonds and French lace. It was a sea of polished surfaces, a room designed to celebrate the absolute triumph of the Duke of Ashbourne. But in the shadows of the service door, Elias Thorne stood, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He had discarded his grimy, flower-stained apron. Beneath it, he wore the fine wool suit he had kept in a cedar chest for 10 years, the suit he had worn when he was the most respected pâtissier in London. He looked like a gentleman, but he felt like an executioner. The Duke stood at the center of the room, radiant with a terrifying arrogance. Beside him stood his young bride, a girl whose eyes held the glazed look of a trapped bird. The marriage had been consecrated an hour ago at St. George's, and now the world waited for the crowning glory of the feast. The Duke signalled with a sharp flick of his wrist, and the massive oak doors swung open. The room fell into a sudden, expectant silence as the wedding cake was wheeled in. It was a towering 5-tier cathedral of spice and sugar, shimmering under the gaslight. The silver leaf caught the glow of the candles, and the diamond dust Elias had painstakingly applied to the top tier glittered like a dusting of fresh winter frost. It was a monument to the Duke's wealth, a masterpiece that seemed too perfect to be real. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Duke's voice boomed, cutting through the silence, "they say that to build a legacy, one must have a taste for the finest things. Tonight we celebrate the union of two great houses, and we do so with a confection that reflects the brilliance of our future." The Duke took the silver serving knife, his fingers brushing the handle with a possessive greed. He looked toward the service door, catching Elias's eye for a brief, mocking second. He thought he had won. He thought the baker was broken, a servant to his secrets. He didn't see the black leather-bound ledger tucked into Elias's waistband, nor did he see the journalists from the London Gazette, who had been strategically positioned near the head table, their notebooks ready. The Duke carved the first ceremonial slice from the top tier. The spice blend released a fragrance so rich it seemed to intoxicate the nearby guests, notes of clove, nutmeg, and dark ginger. He handed a small piece to his bride, who took a hesitant bite, and then he took a large, triumphant mouthful for himself. But as the Duke began to chew, the triumph in his eyes flickered. It started as a faint irritation, a strange, crystalline grit that seemed to prickle against the back of his throat. He swallowed, and the feeling intensified. It wasn't pain, not yet, but a sharp, dry discomfort that made his breath catch. He tried to speak, to offer a toast to his father-in-law, but the words died in his throat. He began to cough, a dry, hacking sound that seemed out of place in such a refined setting. "Is something wrong, Your Grace?" Mr. Sterling, the bride's father, asked, his brow furrowing with concern. The Duke couldn't answer. Every time he tried to clear his throat, the fine glass dust, invisible and lethal, irritated the delicate linings of his esophagus. It was as if the lies he had told for decades were finally manifesting as a physical barrier. He reached for a glass of champagne, gulping it down, but the liquid only served to wash more of the shimmering dust deeper into his system. He began to gag, his face turning a deep, bruised purple. And then Elias Thorne stepped out from the shadows. He didn't move like a servant. He walked with the measured grace of a man who had reclaimed his soul. He walked straight to the head table, the silence of the room deepening until the only sound was the Duke's desperate, ragged breathing. Elias didn't look at the guests. He looked at the Duke, whose eyes were wide with a sudden, paralyzing terror. "You have a taste for the truth, Your Grace," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "It's a bit gritty, isn't it? A bit hard to swallow?" Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out the black ledger. He laid it on the table in front of Mr. Sterling and the journalists. "This is the Duke's true legacy," Elias continued, "a record of the lives he has bought and the voices he has silenced. It contains the names of dozens of young women who entered this house and were never heard from again. It contains the truth about my daughter Mary and the child he kept in his scullery like a dog." The room erupted. The journalists scrambled forward, their pens flying across the pages. Mr. Sterling, a man whose wealth was built on industry but whose heart still held a shred of honor, opened the ledger. His face paled as he read the entries, the payoffs, the disappearances, the cold-blooded calculations of a predator. The Duke tried to lung for the book, but his body betrayed him. The irritation in his throat had turned into a searing heat. He clutched his neck, a small trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth, not from a deep wound, but from the myriad tiny abrasions caused by the diamond dust. It was the banquet of bloody throats, a metaphorical and physical choking on his own crimes. "Halloway?" The Duke managed to wheeze, looking for his butler, but Halloway was nowhere to be seen. Seeing the tide turn, the butler had already vanished into the night, taking what gold he could find in the Duke's study. The Duke was alone, surrounded by the very people whose respect he had spent a lifetime trying to buy, all of them now looking at him with a mixture of horror and disgust. "Where is the girl?" Mr. Sterling demanded, slamming his fist onto the table. "Where is the child mentioned in this book?" Elias didn't wait for the Duke to answer. He knew where she was. He turned and ran toward the back of the house, his heart pounding. He burst into the kitchen, which was now a scene of chaos as the servants realized the world upstairs was collapsing. He ran to the scullery, where a heavy-set man in a coachman's coat was trying to pull a struggling Pip toward the rear exit. "Let her go!" Elias roared. The coachman looked up, startled. "The Duke's orders! She's for the workhouse!" Elias didn't argue. He picked up a heavy copper pot and swung it with the strength of a man who had spent a decade harboring a righteous fury. The blow caught the coachman on the temple, sending him crashing into a rack of tin pans. Pip fell to the floor, gasping. Elias knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms. He felt her small heart hammering against his chest. "I've got you," he whispered, tears finally breaking through his resolve. "I've got you, Pip. We're leaving this place. We're never coming back." He took the silver locket from around her neck and tucked it safely into his pocket. Then he lifted her into his arms and walked out of the service entrance into the thick London fog. Behind them, Ashbourne House was a hive of shouting voices and flickering lights, but for Elias, the world had already gone silent. The aftermath was a swift and brutal collapse for the Duke of Ashbourne. The London Gazette published the contents of the ledger the following morning, a scandal so profound it reached the ears of the Queen herself. The Duke's assets were frozen. His wedding was annulled by the bride's father before the ink was even dry on the registry, and a murder inquiry was opened into the disappearances of the girls listed in the Black Book. Knowing the noose was tightening, the Duke didn't wait for the police. He fled the country in the middle of the night, leaving behind his title, his fortune, and his hollow reputation. He was last seen in a squalid port town in France, a broken man who could never speak above a whisper, his throat permanently scarred by the diamond dust that had forced the truth from his mouth. But for Elias and Pip, the story found a different ending. They didn't stay in London. They travelled south, far from the soot and the shadows of the Thames, until they reached a small seaside village in Cornwall. There, where the air smelled of salt and wild gorse, Elias used the last of his meagre savings to open a small, honest bakery. It wasn't a grand patisserie on Bond Street, but it was a home. Years passed. The morning sun would rise over the Atlantic, casting a golden light into the bakery windows. Elias, his hair now white as flour, would stand at the heavy wooden counter, his hands still scarred, but no longer trembling. Beside him stood Pip, no longer a ghost in the cellar, but a bright-eyed young woman who had found her voice. He was teaching her how to knead bread. "The secret isn't in the strength of your hands, Pip," he said softly. "It's in the patience of the heart. You have to listen to the dough, you have to know when it's ready to rise." Pip nodded, her hands moving with a grace that mirrored his own. On the counter between them sat the silver locket. It was no longer dented and dirty. It had been polished until it shone like a mirror. Inside, Elias had placed a small, hand-painted miniature of Mary, and beside it, a picture of himself and Pip on the day they arrived in Cornwall. The bakery became the heart of the village. People came from miles around, not for towering monuments of sugar, but for the simple, honest bread and the spice cakes that tasted of warmth and safety. Elias never made a 5-tier cake again. He didn't need to. He had realized that in a world of polished surfaces and high walls, the truth is a grit that no amount of sugar can hide. As the sun began to set on another peaceful day, Elias looked out at the water. He thought of the Duke, a man who had everything and ended with nothing. And he thought of himself, a man who had lost everything and ended with a life that finally, for the first time in 10 years, tasted sweet. The moral of our story is simple, yet it echoes through the centuries. Justice, though it may be served cold, is the only meal that truly satisfies the soul. And the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, will eventually find its way to the surface, sometimes with the help of a little diamond dust. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey through the shadows of Victorian London. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel to join us for more narratives of mystery and redemption. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Give this story a rating from 0 to 10. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, remember that even in the darkest fog, a single candle can lead the way home.